Hello, my name's Tony Foster and I'm an alcoholic. And today I'm going to be talking to you about step 3. And you may be thinking, well, why does this guy think he can tell me what step 3 is all about? Well, I'm just going to tell you what I've been taught. I've been sober almost 21 years. I've been through the steps myself as a sponsee 4 or 5 times. I've taken sponsees through the steps probably more than 120 times. And I've taught the third step at seminars, in treatment centers, and I believe the third step is at least as important as step 1. We always hear in meetings that step 1 is so important. I think step 3 is at least that important, and the 12 and 12 tells us that. Now, speaking of the 12 and 12, what documents am I going to use to go through with you to talk about step 3? First of all, the aforementioned 12 and 12, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and a document called Working Step 3, and I'm going to give you a link to this. Working Step 3 was written by a group in the first 100 sober people in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's really kind of a hardcore piece-by-piece look at step 3 and tell you what you really need to know about step 3. It changed my whole view of step 3 when I found this about 18 years ago. And the way that I've taught the third step ever since has been from this document. Everything in the document comes out of the Big Book or the 12 and 12, so it's just explaining things like made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood it. It talks about how it's more than making a decision. I've heard many people in meetings say, oh, my sponsor just told me all I had to do was make a decision. No, there's a lot of work that goes into it. The books tell us that it's the first action step, and this explains that in a way that is so basic that it's easy to understand, and it tells you what the action is. So let's get started. If you're watching this as part of my 12-step series, you may have watched steps 1 and 2. This will follow that format pretty much the same way. Reading from a book, giving you my experience, and using outside documents all related to Alcoholics Anonymous. So in step 3 tells us we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. So, as I said earlier, it's more than making a decision. So I want to say up front, I'm now telling you what step 3 is not. It's not just making a decision. It's much more than that. The 12 and 12 tells us as much right at the beginning. So let's take a look at that. So in the very first page of step 3 in the 12 and 12, you'll see all my highlights there. The second paragraph says, like all the remaining steps, step 3 calls for affirmative action. Making a decision is not an affirmative action. If I jump out of an airplane and I make a decision to pull the ripcord, that's not an affirmative action. Pulling the ripcord is an affirmative action. For it is only by action that we can cut away the self-will that has always blocked the entry of God, and if you like, a higher power. Further down that paragraph at the bottom of the page, it says, in fact, the effectiveness of the whole AA program will rest upon how well and earnestly we've tried to come to a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Not my God, not their God, your God, however you understand Him. And if you want to call Him higher power, if you want to call Him nature, whatever you want to call whoever your creator is, whoever causes the wind to blow and the rain to fall and all the things that happen in life, whatever that is, I call Him God. Sometimes I call Him higher power. It doesn't really matter, but it's yours, not mine. I'm not trying to convince you of any particular higher power. I'm also not trying to make you someone who is religious. What I'm trying to do is make decisions that are based in your higher power's will. And by that I mean most of us know the difference between right and wrong. God wants us to do what's right. So let's make the next right decision. As I just mentioned, the bottom of page 34, the whole effectiveness of the AA program falls on how well you do step 3. No other step in the 12 and 12 or the Big Book tells us that no other step has as much importance as this one. But it doesn't only tell us once. It tells us at the end also. It says, then it is explained that the other steps in the AA program can be practiced with success only when step 3 is given a determined and persistent trial. That's on page 40, the last full page in the 12 and 12 of step 3. Okay, so again, then it is explained that the other steps of the AA program can be practiced with success only when step 3 is given a determined and persistent trial. Further down, to end step 3 in the 12 and 12, it says, our whole trouble has been the misuse of willpower. We've tried to bombard our problems with it instead of attempting to bring it into agreement with God's intentions for us. God's intentions for us. So you might be saying, well, I don't believe in a higher power, or I don't believe in God, or I don't, I'm atheist, or I'm agnostic, or I don't want to rely on something I can't see, hear, smell, whatever it might be. I understand that. I came into AA thinking that I was God. Not in a wacko way, thinking that I was God in the way that I determined my own future. You determined your own. Other people determined their own. So everybody was their own God. That was my belief system. And it was put upon me that if I continued down that road, it's possible I could stay sober, but I wouldn't be getting the most out of being a sober man if I did it that way. And so the decision I made was to follow direction and do the things that I was told to do when I was in treatment. Things like pray and meditate every day. Pray in the morning and at night. I meditate in the morning. I also meditate sometime during the day if I need to, or if I'm going into a stressful situation. I could not deny by the third or fourth day of doing that my outlook wasn't changing. I started to have some hope that I could stay sober, so I kept doing it. And I kept following directions, because right from the beginning, it was proven to me that following directions based in God's will was helping me, and that my life could be better, so I did. As far as depending on a higher power, on page 36, it talks about, that's in the middle of step 3, the more we become willing to depend upon a higher power, the more independent we actually are. Imagine if our decisions were not really our decisions. They were decisions based in God. How is it that we're going to be accused of being selfish or making bad decisions if we do the best we can to follow our higher power or God's will? That's the key. And that gives us a freedom. For me, it was like taking the monkey off my back. If I did something following God's will and somebody else didn't like the decision, I could think to myself or even say to them, look, that's what I thought I was supposed to do. That's what I thought the next right decision was for me under those circumstances. And I'm willing to live with that. And it's worked out pretty well for me. So that's the 12 and 12. Now, as far as the Big Book is concerned, the Big Book stresses step 3 on pages 60 to 63. Okay, so we're going to turn to that now and go over a few parts in there. So step 3 begins towards the bottom of page 60, and if you've been to a lot of AA meetings, or even if you haven't, you probably have experienced reading how it works at the beginning of a meeting. Not every meeting does that, but most do. How it works ends with an introduction to step 3 of saying, our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if he were sought. That is the bridge to the third step. Okay, God could and would if he were sought. Now, if you're cynical about that and you think, well, God can already see what I'm doing, God's looking for a relationship. Okay, spirituality, as defined in AA, is trying to create a relationship with your higher power. Okay, the relationship comes from us seeking him by praying. That's one way to seek. By meditating, then we're receiving from God. That's the way it was taught to me, and I can't tell you how many times I've prayed about something and the answers I needed came while I was meditating. So prayer and meditation is part of how we seek and receive from God. So then it says, being convinced, we were at step 3, which is that we decided to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood it. Just what do we mean by that, and just what do we do? So I'm gonna go to working step 3 now, because in working step 3, it really takes most of its information from the big book, and so I would just be repeating myself to doing both. So I've been harping a little bit on the fact that you're doing more than making a decision. In working step 3, it talks about, and I'm going to read pieces of it here. It says, most people think that the third step says that we turn our will and our life over to the care of God. But it doesn't say that. What it says is we make a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God. It goes on to say, for any decision to mean anything, it always requires further action. Okay? For if we decide or make up our mind to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understand him, that decision alone will not turn it over. We will have to take the action necessary to turn it over. The first 3 steps are designed to bring us to the point where we become willing to turn our will and lives over to the care of a higher power. Steps 4 through 9 are how we turn our will and our life over, by removing the blocks that prevent us from actually doing so. And the last 3 steps are how we keep our will and our lives turned over to God indefinitely. Okay? Does that make sense? I hope it does, because it helped clear up some things to me. So going further down the first page, and this is a 6-page document, it begins to talk about self-will. And the first requirement, and I'm reading directly from the document now, the first requirement, and please notice that it says requirement, not suggestion. Often I hear that the steps are only suggestions. This is from the first 100. It's not me making it up. The first requirement, and please notice that it says requirement, not suggestion, is that we become convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. On that basis, we are almost always in collision with something or somebody, even though our motives are good. Most people try to live by self-propulsion. Not just alcoholics, but most people. Each person is forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, and the rest of the players in his own way. If his arrangements would only stay put, if only people would do as he wished, the show would be great. Everybody, including himself, would be pleased. Life would be wonderful. In trying to make these arrangements, our actor may sometimes become quite virtuous. He may be kind, considerate, patient, generous, even modest, and self-sacrificing. On the other hand, he may be mean, egotistical, selfish, and dishonest. But as with most humans, he is more likely to have varied traits. This is all out of the big book. Again, I'm not making it up. It's just highlighted to show you the important parts. So what usually happens? The show doesn't come off very well. He begins to think life doesn't treat him right. He decides to exert himself more. He becomes, on the next occasion, still more demanding or gracious, as the case may be. Still, the play does not suit him. Admitting he may be somewhat at fault, he is sure that other people are more to blame. He becomes angry, indignant, and self-pitying. What is his basic trouble? Is he not really a self-seeker even when trying to be kind? Is he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest, which means to take away by force, rest, satisfaction, and happiness out of this world if he only manages or manipulates well. All right? I've heard it said that us as alcoholics and addicts are the greatest manipulators on the planet. I can only speak for me. I was a great manipulator. Is it not evident to all the rest of the players that these are the things he wants? And do not his actions make each of them wish to retaliate, snatching all they can out of the show? Is he not, even in his best moments, a producer of confusion rather than harmony? Does that mean anything to you? Do you understand that? Did you get anything from that? Do you not relate to that at all? I relate to it completely. Further down, it says selfishness, self-centeredness, and you may remember that from the big book. Self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. And I always thought alcohol was the problem. That's what the document says. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows and retaliate. I have to read that one again because this is a sentence that I find in almost every alcoholic and addict. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Do you relate to that? Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation, but we invariably find that at some time in the past we've made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. As the book continues, it says, they arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. It's important to know that this includes before we stopped drinking, while we were drinking, and even prior to taking step 3 since we've stopped drinking. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without his aid. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. So it's saying that the only thing that we have going for us, which is self-will and self-knowledge, or my life run on my will, is the very thing that will lead us back to drinking or progressive misery as time passes. You've heard of the dry drunk. This is what leads to the dry drunk. You may have heard of happy, joyous, and free. You do this step well, happy, joyous, and free is going to come to you. So, we now come to what to me is the key takeaway from this document. And I'm going to read it directly because it's so powerful. You know, when I was in treatment, a therapist said to me, Tony, you have to surrender. Now, many people, I have to say most men, have been taught their whole lives you never surrender, you never give up. And I grew up in an era where my father fought in World War II and he was English. So he remembers the words in his head all the time, you never surrender, you never give up. And he passed those down to me. So surrendering was something that I couldn't do, but I had to. I had to do it to survive. So I'm going to read it now. So the AA program ultimately asks us to make 2 surrenders, not just 1. We need to surrender to our drinking alcohol. We did this in step 1. But we also need to surrender to our self-will, or my life run on my will, and we do this in step 3. Unfortunately, many members of AA only make the first surrender and inevitably do not experience all the freedom, joy, and serenity that the AA way of life promises. Because of not surrendering their self-will, they are often miserable and or go back to drinking. Now, again, as I said earlier, you may go like this. I know I go like this. I still, 21 years later, still take my will back sometimes. But I'm very aware of it now. One of the ways I stay aware of it is through the 3rd step prayer. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm not perfect at turning my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand Him. But I do it much more often than I don't. And in critical decisions, I know I have to call on my higher power. So, At the bottom of page 32, the authors tell us what we have to do in order to rid ourselves of our selfishness. And here we go. This is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. Next, we decided that hereafter in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. He is the principal, we are his agents. He's the father, and we are his children. Most good ideas are simple, and this concept was the keystone of the new and triumphant arch through which we pass to freedom. Now, when I got to step 3, I was starting to believe in something greater than me because I had been praying and meditating now for about 2 weeks because we did the first 3 steps in treatment. And my life was starting to get better. Every day it was progressing and I was getting more and more hope. And it might have only been in little tiny increments, but over 2 weeks it was definite. I could feel it. So I continued to do what I was told and follow, as I was told, the simple direction. And I kept thinking in my head of the end of how it works. God could and would if he were sought. So I kept seeking. So to read further on, for those who do not know, the keystone is the supporting stone of the entire structure. So the third step decision is the supporting step for the rest of the steps. And we've alluded to that in the 12 and 12. Now this decision is starting to sound important. The big book just stated that we need to let God become our director, so we need to be doing what we think our higher power would have us do. In other words, we must be staying in the moment, being directed by unselfishness and love, and doing the next right thing. It also says we need to move in the direction of being God's agent. And since an agent is given the power to represent the principle, we are deciding to start acting in a way that would represent our higher power. It then mentions being God's children, and if we're God's children, we need to start acting as if we're all equal brothers and sisters. Okay, continuing with working step 3, it tells us, please note, the authors of the big book say to do step 4 at once following step 3. That is the action portion of step 3, is to immediately go on to step 4. It's telling us that the third step decision will have little permanent effect unless we immediately, in capital letters, immediately follow it up with a strenuous effort to look at our past, both positive and negative. So that's working step 3, the document. It's also step 3 out of the big book and the 12 and 12. And I want to close by going over the third step prayer. The third step prayer is one of the most popular prayers in AA, and it's something that many sponsors say with their sponsees as the sponsee is completing the third step. It goes like this. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. So step 3 and the third step prayer really talk about turning ourselves over, turning our will over. You'll hear that a lot in meetings. And that's what's happening here in this prayer. God, I offer myself to thee, turning myself over to you, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt, to be led by you, to be directed by you. Relieve me of the bondage of self. Take away those crazy thoughts in my head that make me do the things I don't want to do. That I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help. So if you take away my difficulties, people around me are going to know how you took away my difficulties, because I'm going to tell people. So those I would help, of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life, may I do thy will always. So the third step prayer, it ends with affirming that I'm going to turn my will over, I'm going to follow your will, and then I'm going to tell people how I got better by following your will, in hopes that other people will do the same thing. As I said, there will be a link to this in the video at the end, as well as working step 3. I hope this helps you with step 3. A lot of people underplay its importance. As I said at the beginning, to me it's equally important to step one, and I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I hope to see you again when we do step 4 soon.